Raj has actually been with Wilkerson for a little over 48 years now. Mark has been in the world of investments for 28 years. They both started at the age of 10. But we are going to have them come up and address some topics on alternative investments with quite a bit of experience behind each of them to address the topic. And Raj has his professorial jacket on with the leather patches, so he is ready to teach. Raj, here we go.
All right. Well, if I get to wear my leather patch jacket, you better watch your talk, because I may talk longer then. And first, there were some questions that were written in and handed in, and I'm hoping we'll get through all of them before the day is over. But I want to share a couple of them with kind of a lead-in on some of what I want to say. There's one question that says, I fear that the U.S. is in for a period of long-term stagnation. Despite the roaring stock market, our recovery from the Great Recession has been weak, with continued high unemployment, underemployment, and weak consumer demand. This does not bode well for the long-term prospect of the U.S. economy. Please comment on this. What can be done to get out of these doldrums and accelerate economic recovery? Hope that I can address that. First, I want to say, I do not consider this the Great Recession. I consider it a depression, as people have heard me speak before. Recessions and depressions start very differently. There have been 100 depressions since the Great Depression. This is a depression. It's been from over-leveraged economies. And so it takes much longer to crawl out of them. The other thing that I want to be very thankful for is there's a straight line understanding here that there is a disconnect between economies and markets. And they have to be thought of very differently. Now, hopefully I can address most of this as we get on, and I want to address one other one quickly. One of the questions here was the place of gold and other metals in a portfolio. You may remember last year I brought in a kite, and I said gold is like a kite. It flies high, and when it loses its wind, it comes down quickly. Well, gold was up around 1900, it's now about 1250, 1260. So that kite has come down. In Wall Street terms, they say that any investment that goes up like a rocket, that doesn't have intrinsic value, will fall like a stick. So gold is still a vulnerable investment to be in. Doesn't mean it won't catch the wind again, but it certainly has lost the wind for now. Now, I think that Robert was going to be my slide pusher. And what we have here is I wanted to mention gold first, because it's not here. We have a collection of alternative investments here. These alternative investments you heard very little about before 2000. There's been a lot of stimulus to get the response to create the concept of alternative investment. What is an alternative investment? That's an investment where I can theoretically invest, get a reasonable rate of return that's not correlated with the equity markets or the bond markets, so that I can smooth out that curve that would, in other words, not be very lumpy. In the words of Warren Buffett, it would be smoother. But Warren Buffett also said, I'd rather have a 15% bumpy rate of return than a 12% smooth rate of return. But these are alternative investments. You're going to find out they're overly correlated with the S&P index. And on these, we're going to have Mark Hadley do the heavy lifting to really explain what these alternatives are about. Now, I want to spend a fair amount of time with this next slide. Now, the one right after this, I guess. But we go back to that. I want to address it just a hair. Where are they popular now? Especially, we've got people skeptical of stock markets, so there's really room to sell them in the alternative investments. People need portfolio income, so there's really room to sell them in alternative investments. There's industry hype, and it's mostly driven by fees. So I want you to realize that alternative investments are fee generators. And you're also going to, weaving through all of what I'm going to say here, is stimulus and response. This fee generation is a response to a stimulus. Now if I can see the next slide. This one I want to spend a little time with. In fact, in my mind, when I look at this slide, I think of the Great Gatsby book, or the movie. Remember, everything that happened that people thought happened was not true. Everything they believed wasn't there. Well, that's exactly what this slide is about. First, I'm going to take you just for a moment before the year 2000. In the late 1990s, we got everybody in the firm that was over, say, age 50 to try and talk them into getting some of their investments in bonds, fixed income securities, if they were near retirement age, because a storm was coming. We could see the investment storm coming, and we got as many people in the firm as we could, and to try to get them to give them help. And you may remember my comments many times have been when storms come, they last from 12 to 15 years. And the worst storm maybe was 1965 and the next 13 years thereafter. But this is another 13-year storm. And it has predating it some things that led to both the storm and the economy. Take you back first to the 80s for just a moment. Quality movement happened. Quality movement happened, and all of a sudden, manufacturing we need to become more technology, less back labor, and we outsource. A lot of people would be left out of the employment world without getting a good education. There, the stimulus was there to get an education, but it really has not happened on a grand scale. Unfortunately, those very folks that are living in a culture of not acquiring skills, which you need in this economy, are now competing against a lot of the people that were unemployed by the construction boom. That went bang. You know, we built every home we could possibly afford in this country by the end of 2004. But we kept on building for 2005, 2006, right up to October of 2007. So what was pushing us that stimulus to keep on doing that? I mean, you couldn't put a cast of characters that big together and say, how could you all look the other way? I don't care if the Federal Reserve, the SEC, individuals, all the regulators, why could they all be asleep? So that's why we're going to take a look at this next, starting in 2000. In 2000, that was the most overpriced market since 1929. The next thing that's important to know, you're looking at an S&P index fund. And most people think if they have an S&P index fund or 500 companies, they have diversification. In the year 2000, March, when markets cratered, you did not have diversification. You had 25 companies that represented 45% of the value of the S&P. We had a NASDAQ trading at a PE of 196 on the average. Those 45 or 25 companies, 5 of them are worth 10 cents on the dollar right now. And many of them are worth about a third. I can name them off, but you'll remember the WorldComs and Nortels and so forth. Well, so what you saw when you saw that and you thought you had that wealth, it did not exist. So what you saw in 2000, it was such a concentrated portfolio, and a concentrated portfolio that was running on blue smoke and gray mirrors. And folks bought into it, and unfortunately, a lot of people didn't get to our seminars, and they started retiring in those early years. And in those early years, as they retired, they were dipping into their equity and selling their stocks on the downdraft. So we ended up with a lot of retirees without adequate resources, and we have a lot of retirees without adequate resources because they went down there. Now, a lot of them have been told this economy and this market has really recovered just like a V. False. What's happened? So we end up going down in the trough. We get up to 207, and we come back down, and we're now up here when somebody says, this has really recovered. You realize from 2000 to 2013, at 2 to 3% inflation, that's 40% compounded. This would have to be 40% higher to have made that market a real market in 2000. So people were working from a songbook that just did not work. So the retirees are not adding to the aggregate demand that you want to. We got too many people bringing children into this world before they have an education. That's a drag on this economy. We have all kinds of people that were forced to become roofers to go from roofer say to a nurse, about 25% of construction has recovered. So an awful lot of people in the construction industry, the mortgage industry, and so forth are all having to be retooled, and they're being retooled with still a group that's coming from a culture that's not getting adequately educated. We have real headwinds in our face. Because we also still have these retirees without adequate resources. This recovery, incidentally, is the slowest recovery since Second World War II. And if it keeps on at the rate it's going to be, it will be the slowest recovery since the Great Depression. In fact, during this recovery, it started 3 years ago, we've heard that it increased 4 million jobs. Had this been a normal recovery, we've had 10 economic downturns since World War II. And on the average, had this been a normal recovery, we would have added by now an average recovery, 6.5 million more jobs. Also, if it had been an average recovery, GDP would not have grown 1.9, roughly 2% since the downdraft. It would have grown, 7% since the downdraft is about what it's grown. It would have grown 16%. And that difference doesn't sound like enormous, but it's $1.2 trillion of aggregate demand that's missing in this economy. So what has been driving this market up? It was as high as a kite back then, primarily not earnings, primarily buybacks by corporations of their shares, increasing earnings per share. So we don't have a really what I call extraordinarily overly priced market. It's a totally priced market, but it's a market not being driven over these last years that much by corporate earnings, but more by corporations buying back their stock. And that has at least brought some real recovery to the retirees, and that's essentially the recovery of the market is exactly what quantitative easing was trying to accomplish. Unfortunately, quantitative easing was the hardest on the middle class because they're savers, not investors, and the savers got very little on their savings. So that is kind of what has happened in a very subpar recovery. And we are in a market that's reasonably priced right now, but an economy that's got these tremendous headwinds. Undereducated workforce in many cases, people that are having to be retooled, even if they have the work ethic in many cases, retirees with inadequate resources. And so it's not going to be easy. So when this author of this question says stagnation, I can see some stagnation. I'm going to try and answer a little bit too. People want to know where we're headed. No one really knows where we're headed, but there's this logic in my mind goes like this. The large banks now got about $4 trillion left in them. We've never increased the balance sheet at the Federal Reserve without having inflation in history. And all of those funds are now an increased money supplier, not in my pocket, they're not in your pocket, they're sitting in the big banks. They're in reserves. These banks are going to want to make some loans. And so I see some credit standards eventually going down. And I see us getting back into more of a leveraged economy than we probably should be. The politicians will kind of give in. And so I think we will see some inflation. And we will see interest rates go up. And hopefully not through the sky. Here's where I'm going to be watching. The markets will pretty well reflect the real economy once you get everything flushed through it. If interest rates are about 5.5 on 10-year treasuries. Once you get past 5.5% on 10-year treasuries, the interest rates going up and inflation starts to really impact the equities. So where do you want to be in the future? In my mind, I want to own bonds that I can own till maturity, not a bond fund. I want to own stocks, if I can, primarily with dividend-paying companies, hopefully not necessarily in funds, only in funds if I can afford to wait long terms, because I believe in 12 to 15-year holding periods of having enough resources not to have to sell equities in down markets. If you look at this right now, 13 years later, is the first time there's an inflow of funds into the equity markets, like the funds, for 13 years. There's been a net outflow for the last 13 years. make sure you have dry gunpowder. And I'm getting a message back there, they're saying, I gotta call it a day almost, I guess. But I want to get Mark up here to do the heavy lifting.